Thanks everyone, welcome. I'll be talking about fairness in terms of utilities. So what we know is that redistribution is often understood in terms of fairness of the resulting monetary allocation to people. The seminal work by Fair and Smith, they model fairness as aversion to inequitable outcomes, irrespective of how that outcome is achieved. Can you hear me now? Yeah? Okay, good. More recently, fairness has also been defined over the process that actually leads to these outcomes. And then I'm thinking about work, for example, on intentions by Rabin, where the idea is that if someone has a fair or a kind intention, that the other person will reciprocate this intention. And the extent to which that distribution is then fair or that action is kind is then evaluated against the payoff distribution. Cox has a similar approach where they look at, in his Econometrica paper, where they look at how someone is responding to generous actions. So if someone is generous, then there is a response to this, which can be then more altruistic. They call it more altruistic then. Another way that people have thought about these procedures is in terms of effort. So there's the work of Cherry and then of Karlijn, where people think about fairness, not in terms of the allocation again, but in terms of the effort that both individuals have invested into creating that monetary allocation. And even in Pamela et al., they identify different types who reciprocate effort in different ways. And more recently, there's also reciprocation of ex-ante opportunities, where in the paper by Brock and Karlijn, where people care about ex-ante what people do in a risky context, and if people, for example, take risk, then the idea is, at least in Karlijn, that people reciprocate less or negatively reciprocate if people take on more risk. But since economists typically think about decision-making in terms of utility, what I will be doing in this paper is thinking about fairness in terms of utilities and not in terms of outcomes or the process that has led to these outcomes. So what will I do in this paper? In this paper I investigate to what extent individuals' attitudes towards fairness are defined over the utility over outcomes. I do that by playing a one-shot dictator game where recipients, before actual risks are realized and transfers are realized, make decisions to increase or decrease their risk exposure. And I do this in a risky context. Since I'm interested in utility over outcomes, a risky context allows me to think about risk preferences, so I can identify risk preferences separately, and I can also identify decisions in a risky context separately. And furthermore, I do this in Ethiopia. And why do I do this in Ethiopia? Because in Ethiopia it is known, based on several recent papers, that there's a large share of people that are actually risk tolerant. So what I'm able to do is have risk averse and risk tolerant people in my sample, and then I'm going to investigate how this has consequences for the extent to which they are reciprocal in terms of the risk-taking decisions of others. So in my experimental design, I have 1,528 Ethiopian subjects, and they were teamed up in two-person groups to play one-shot dictator games in a risky context. So the recipient's income was exposed to risk, and in the benchmark, the recipients had no agency over their risk exposure, while in the treatment games, I have one treatment game where recipients can choose to reduce their risk exposure, and a treatment game where they can choose to increase their risk exposure. So there, the recipient actually takes an action, which then the dictator can reciprocate. The dictator makes strategic conditional transfer decisions in cases of losses. So that means that a dictator makes decisions for all the possible states. So I have within subject design, so a dictator makes a decision for this benchmark game where there's no action by the recipient, but also in the cases where there is an action of the recipient. And he does that by eliciting his choices before risks are realized and based for all the different decisions that the a recipient makes. And then what I also do is I conduct incentivized multiple price lists with choices between safe amounts and risky lotteries. And there's a lot of discussion going on about how to do risk preference solicitation in developing countries. Binswanger is set to massively overestimate risk aversion, and a series of recent papers, they use this multiple price list, safe versus risky prospect decision. So this is just to show you the context, since it's a development in economics conference. If you can see these cubicles, these wooden things in the front, they slide up so that I could have a central explanation of my experiments, but then people could answer in private. And the risk taking and the risk reduction were explained in terms of, to make it understandable for the subject pool, in terms of weather risks and gains and losses in crops. Just for information, if you're concerned about the understanding of the games, I also asked the subjects that I played with lots of questions to test their understanding in terms of what payoffs and what probabilities. And 80%, which surprised me a lot, but they had this sheet in front of them to answer their questions, but 80% of the farmers answered 10 questions correct about the payoffs. So, how I'm going to identify these reciprocal preferences and decisions to reciprocate is by using a model where, if you just imagine that I have I as the dictator and J is the recipient, then I use a model by Charnes and Rabin of social preferences, where the idea is that fairness is determined based on a distributional preference and a reciprocal preference. I modify that slightly, this function. I make this based on Cobb-Douglas preferences with convex indifference curves, because then I get continuous transfers. I don't assume constant marginal utility between the outcome of one person and the outcome of another person. So let's go to this model. So here I have the utility of I defined over xi, and then I use R as risk preferences. I show that here for completeness, but I'll show you also later that it doesn't matter in the model that I use what form of risk preferences we assume. What matters here is that the social preferences are defined over the utility of the recipient and the utility over outcomes of the dictator. And then I have, and the resulting social preference function is a product of both. But what matters for you to understand here is that I have two parameters. I have a theta parameter and a rho parameter and a theta parameter. The rho parameter is the typical distributional preferences parameter with which I kind of use to think about how much I weigh the other person's welfare. My theta parameter is a reciprocity parameter. And theta, as you can see, is also dependent on Q, where Q is -1 if in I's perception J has misbehaved. So the idea is that in the games that I have where the other person takes an action, if the other person takes an action that is perceived as unkind, then this Q kicks in, and then a theta parameter kicks in that reduces the extent to which I weigh the other person's welfare. So if you think back about my games, I obviously have these transfer decisions and the outcomes before transfers, which are then representative of this X here. So how do I use this model? What I can basically see, it's very simple, is that in the game, for example, the benchmark game, where the other person does not make a decision, then transfers are given by this function because Q is 0. It's just rho times outcome of the dictator, 1 minus rho times outcome of the recipient. While in the case, in my treatment games, where there is reciprocal behavior, the dictator can then reciprocate the action of the recipient, and then this theta parameter may kick in. So if rho, what's clear from my model, you can see in the paper, rho is independent of R, but the point is that theta is dependent on R. So based on my own risk preferences, I can then evaluate the action of the other person, and if I'm risk averse, then a choice by the other person to increase their risk exposure is then perceived as unkind, because they are presenting me with an opportunity set with more variance. While if I am risk tolerant, a choice by J to decrease risk exposure is unkind, and that will be negatively reciprocated. So what I'm showing you here is that there are several, so what is possible is that people just have distributional preferences. In the paper, I also work that through and show that estimation on my data. I don't show it here, because what it would imply is that just in all cases, there would be a rho parameter driving transfers and no theta parameter. But then I have two other models. One is the case where an individual reciprocates, another person negatively reciprocates, so reduces transfers when the other person reduces their risk, and the other case when a person increases their risk. And then I have for all the decisions that I have, these are the parameters that are relevant in those decisions. And as you can see, for the negatively reciprocating risk reduction, these are different than they are for negatively reciprocating risk taking. So what I then do, which I'm not going to discuss with you, is that I estimate a structural model where I have all these different transfer decisions, all these different equations, and based on those I estimate my rho parameter and my theta parameter. For that I use a model, a hurdle model, where people are either transferring yes or no, and then they are making their transfer decisions based on this rho and this theta. I'm not going to explain, but it's on the paper. But what do I find in terms of the parameter estimates? As you can see, I have here those three different models. Here we have, for example, a row of 36. I'm going to show you some tables which show what this implies in terms of transfers. Here is a row of 40 and a punishment of 0.06. And I have here, in all these columns, I make the assumption that all individuals are the same time. So either I assume that all my people have distributional preferences, or all of them reciprocate risk-taking, or all of them reciprocate risk reduction. But obviously, if there are multiple types, then this estimation is not very precise. So what do I do in the next step? I estimate a mixture model, and in that mixture model, I assume that people are either behaving according to this, or behaving according to this. So that is what you can see here, the estimation, and what you can then here see with this pi parameter. Pi is basically the probability that a type is this type or this type. So what you can see is that 56% of the individuals are actually reciprocating risk-taking, while 44% are reciprocating risk reduction. Funnily enough, that's exactly the percentage of people who are risk-averse versus risk-loving. But I'm going to show you also the next, so of course you want to also know how well do these models do in terms of transfers. So what you see here is actual transfer data. What you see here is the mixture model, and here are the separate models. So as you can see, this pattern is best represented here. Of course I do a formal test for this as well, such as a Wang test. And the same pattern holds here. This is the actual transfers, and here we have the transfers based on the mixture model. But what is most important, I thought I had a slide showing you the distribution of my risk preferences. So basically it's really nicely normally distributed. And when I then add risk preferences in my model, and I do that by assuming that my risk preferences, that my parameter estimates are linear functions of the covariates that I add, and in this case I add risk preferences. And what you can see here is that since this constant is minus 14, what you can see is that an increase in risk preferences towards risk tolerance actually reduces the extent to which people are punishing, and an increase in risk preferences towards risk tolerance increases the extent to which people are punishing or reciprocating risk reduction. And just to show you very simply what this implies, so this is for the case where we're reciprocating risk-taking, If people are becoming more risk averse, they negatively reciprocate risk-taking more. If people are becoming more risk tolerant, they negatively reciprocate risk reduction more. So, conclusion slide. What I find is that reciprocation is heterogeneous, as opposed to lots of work. There are actually different types, and people reciprocate based on their types. And that this heterogeneity in reciprocation can be explained by people's risk preferences, the risk preferences of the dictator. So the conclusion from this is that individuals' attitudes towards fairness or other regarding our social preferences are not only defined over outcomes and over process, but also over the utilities over outcomes.
Okay, so just briefly, I don't want to take up too much time here. I just have a couple of comments. So I think it's a really great, it's a really interesting paper. It's a really nice experiment. So I think the idea of how we evaluate the risks, how we evaluate risk and incorporate the risks that people take into our decisions about transfers is a really nice area of the literature to be expanding. And so I think the general comment that I have is I think there's more from the paper. What's missing right now is a lot of the analysis of the sort of reduced form results, reduced form predictions, and I think you can have some... Oh, I think... oh, this one? Ah, sorry. And so I think I'd like to see more of that. On the structural model, I thought it was interesting. So I think, you know, I'm prejudiced because I've done some work on this, but I think the work that you're doing relates to the series of papers of Shahar Kareev and Ray Fisman and myself, where we estimate constant elasticity of substitution models of social preferences. And so in essence, what you're doing by incorporating risk is what we do by incorporating the elasticity of substitution. We're thinking about how you're making trade-offs between self and other, and how that varies as a function of each of your own payoffs. And so what we're able to show in those papers is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the elasticity of substitution between self and other. In your model, you're assuming that a particular functional form, Cobb-Douglas, and then layering over that risk, and it wasn't clear to me that those were separately identified without making functional form assumptions. So if you didn't... Sorry, can I just... So, I mean, I think, so in terms of, so it's not clear that those things are separately identified. You need to control for the heterogeneity in that elasticity of substitution. And so I think it's important that you speak to that, and I think that relates to the broader point, which is the experiment. The experiment is really interesting, and I think it's really interesting because it's raising this question of whether the risk preferences that I attribute to others in making a utility decision are my own risk preferences or they are my beliefs about others' risk preferences. But I think in terms of if as your model right now is assuming, you're assuming it's my own risk preferences, then I think the distinction between a CES model and a model where you have curvature that you call risk aversion and then an elasticity of substitution over that, it's going to be very fine distinctions based on functional form, and I wasn't sure whether that was really the right avenue to be pursuing. But I think what's interesting, of course, is that you've got this very clean design where you have risk preferences measured separately. If you think about this from a utility framework, the predictions are quite clear. So if I give a risk-averse person the opportunity, if I give a risk-averse dictator, I tell you that your recipient has the opportunity to mitigate risk, that's making them unambiguously better off in expected utility terms. And therefore, I should reduce the amount I need to transfer to them to equalize our utilities. And so I think you have very clean reduced form predictions that aren't being tested in the data about whether I'm attributing to you my risk preferences. Whereas if I'm risk averse and I am faced with a recipient who has the opportunity to have more risk, that doesn't increase their utility at all unless I think they might be a risk-loving type. And so I think you have very clean reduced form predictions that you can really bring out in the data that I think would be very, very compelling. I think in just sort of smaller comments about the paper, right now it's very heavy on the econometrics and the model, and I think there's a lot more that can come out about how it was implemented and translated and what comprehension checks specifically were built in, what happens if you control for the people who didn't understand. But I think the reduced form, the big picture is that bringing in these reduced form results is also going to really help, because in papers of this sort, we're really worried about what happens if your model is misspecified. And so I think having your evidence start from the reduced form predictions is going to assuage concerns that you could have results that are driven by misspecification, which is true of all of this literature of estimating the structural parameters of individual preferences, is what happens if you have the wrong model. And so I think the reduced form discussion, which is really clear in your case, is going to really round that out nicely. Okay, so I'll stop there so that you can take questions.
Sorry, I was so enthusiastic that I interrupted. That was really not my intention. Can I respond quickly? Is that the idea?
I think it can go either way.
Yeah. So I'll quickly respond. So a very good point. I completely agree. I hadn't thought about actually making use of that in terms of CES, because what I also do is in three of my, basically the ones where the outcomes are the same, there I have a clean identification because there's no difference in the differences between them. So that one I could already easily use to just have that reduced form. So I agree with you. That's a very good point. And because I am doing that within subject, that's clean. Yeah, so that basically the main. Thank you very much. I hope I get to talk to you a little bit more afterwards. Yeah. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Okay. Hello. I'm Leandro from the University of Bristol. I might have not followed it thoroughly, but the idea is that you put the parameter for your fairness or your reciprocity preference, and that's what you are able to estimate. Could you argue, can you back it out as just a future? If I just have preferences for you and me, outcomes, but then if I reciprocate, I have an idea of how much I'm going to get in the future, and that's my preference. I could probably model that parameter to be just a future stream of outcomes. And if I model that, then the question about information, whether I'm facing a risk-averse or a risk-loving guy, becomes quite interesting, because I could alter my behavior according to what you want so that I can get reciprocity in the future. I want to raise those points.
I think that's a very nice question. Obviously, I modeled it deliberately like this, the experiments, because there are lots of things that come into play which I've been able to avoid now. For example, my beliefs about risk preferences, my own risk preferences, my belief about your actions, etc. And I think in a reciprocal context, that's a really interesting thing to further explore. I think that I had to make a decision, because there are a couple of these. I mean, it's also how am I going to reciprocate in terms of if I know about the other person's risk preferences. I might also have my own preferences and maybe projecting them on the other person as I do now, but there may be also a situation where I think that you should have certain risk preferences, or where I have a belief about your risk preferences. So there are lots of interesting questions here, and I think yours is also very, very good. Why I focused on this is because in a repeated game, there are so many of these things moving at the same time, and I wouldn't have been able to identify this. Does this answer your question? Yeah.
Calling it preferences over reciprocity,
or your concern is about the term.
Yes.
So there is this literature on strong reciprocity and weak reciprocity, right? And weak reciprocity, and there's much more debate these days about this strong reciprocity, because the typical idea of reciprocity is repeated interactions where people have a strategic objective to reciprocate. But there's also now a recent literature which shows that even in non-repeated interactions, people have strong incentives to reciprocate. And it's very difficult to explain why that is because there is not this strategic interaction, so you have to think about other ways, in like cooperation in the large, where you want to encourage a certain percentage of types in your population, for example, then those kind of things you could think about when you have the strong reciprocity. Other questions?
Thanks. No, I don't use that. Let's just use this. Yeah. Oh, this one, right? Yeah. Yeah. Hi everyone. This can you hear me? So this idea I present here is not about Africa. It's about China, but actually it's quite related. It's about gift expenses and risk sharing. So actually, risk sharing is a key topic in developed economics, and the big barrier to achieve effective risk sharing is the limited commitment problem or the default problem. So actually, how to overcome the limited commitment problem? So the traditional way in previous literature could be like to use a repeated gain, like people won't default because they fear like the sanction in future or the sanction from the other members in the same community. But actually, from our field experience, we think it's somehow very hard to only count on this mechanism because usually the amount of borrowing lending is much more than annual income, and is actually many times than annual income, and consider a very vulnerable village economy. And it is very risky or very costly to only count on the punishment in future or from the other members. So in this way, we think about like, is there any other way to overcome the limit commitment problem? And the way we suggest could be to use emotion. I mean, like to regulate moral hazard behavior by the emotional connection between friends or relatives. And actually, the people when they make a decision of default or not default, maybe they don't think so much like the punishment in future. What they think is only like it's not so good, or it's wrong to default, or they just feel it's guilty or feel it embarrassing, very embarrassing. So that's why we see like from the data, from our data, we find like most borrowing lending just happen between friends or relatives, and the interest rate is very low, and the default rate, at least in China, is also extremely low, almost zero. But actually, it's not so easy to create or to sustain such a network of friends or relatives. So people, like in China, they spend a lot of money on gift to sustain and to build such a network of friends. So we know people spend a lot of money on gifts in China in various occasions, like the wedding ceremony, funerals, and many festivals. And according to our data, and also is confirmed by many other data sources, the share of gift expenses over total living expenditure and even the total income is more than 10%, and sometimes 20%. It means like you spend 1/5 of your total income just on gift. And from our field experience, it's somehow interesting, or we say it's a little bit crude, like some people, they don't have money to finance they don't have cash to finance their gift expenses. They have to go to the counter seats to sell some blood and get some cash to finance their gift expenses. So actually, somehow it's a burden, but people like to spend money on gift. And this gift expenses is not equally distributed to everyone in this village. So actually, it's most gift expenses only on the gift to some specific person, we say friends or relatives. And from the data, more than 80% households, the highest single time gift expenses more than 3.5 times than the average level. So actually, the value of gift is very high. So this is not only observed in China, but also like in Ghana, in some Western African countries, also some Native American communities on some events called potlatch. So actually, we think it is quite obvious to us, like there's a linkage between the gift expenses and we say social network or network of friends and the risk sharing. The linkage is very clear to us, but to really make it logical, we think we have to answer a few motivating questions. So why the friends are trustworthy of borrowing and lending, and who's a friend, and why gift expenses can facilitate risk sharing by identifying friends from non-friends, and what is the welfare implications. That's our general idea. And for the model parts, for the time concern, I cannot go too details. So this model about the linkage between gift expenses, risk sharing is based on 3 assumptions. So first assumption is about risk preference. So people are risk averse, of course. Otherwise, risk sharing is not necessary. So that's the first assumption. And second assumption is about altruism. So we assume people are altruistic to friends. So here we just assume the altruism is a directed altruism. It's only to friends rather than to everyone, to every strangers. So this altruism, directed altruism, is actually a foundation for regulating moral hazard behavior by emotion or some emotional connection. Because when I do a default, I hurt my friends, also I got hurt. So this assumption creates an emotional cost of defaulting. But actually, this is not enough, because even though I'm an altruistic person, I emphasize my friends' benefits. But actually, I also emphasize my own benefits, my own self-interest utility. So it should be stronger than the altruistic part. So that's why we introduce another assumption about guilt aversion. So this is a relationship-based guilt aversion. It means actually we introduced this assumption just to strengthen the cost of defaulting. We try to make the cost of defaulting is bigger than the benefits of defaulting. So in this way, people can actually regulate this moral hazard behavior by this emotional connection or the friendship. So I have no time to go to details in that, but actually it's quite in line with the Chinese context. Like people emphasize the moral issue, especially with friends rather than strangers. They really don't want to make some bad things to friends. So based on these assumptions, it's easy for us to know if we face a friend, we can trust him in borrowing and lending. So they don't default. But and in a very simple game of risk sharing, we try to illustrate based on these 3 assumptions. We try to illustrate why gift expenses can help us to facilitate the risk sharing. So this risk sharing game is quite simple. Like the nature just decide the type of players. The players can be a friend or a non-friend. So a friend is altruistic to us. So of course, in the first best case, we know the type of players. So of course, if I face a friend, he takes me as a friend. Of course, I can trust him, and we can share risk. So we can form a risk sharing group. But for non-friend, it's very likely for him to default. Of course, I won't do that. But the problem is somehow it's very hard to identify friends from a non-friend, especially consider risk sharing. There's benefits of risk sharing. Then everyone, even though even he's a non-friend, he has motivation to pretend to be a friend. So how to identify friend from a non-friend? So in the second best case, without gift, so people are very likely to not share risk with anyone, because it's very likely the other player is a non-friend and will default. But here the gift can help. The gift can help because of a very simple logic. The gift is not a pure cost to a friend, but it's a pure cost to a non-friend. It means I'm your friend. I give you a gift, I make you happy, I'm also happy. So gift is not a pure cost to a friend, but it's a pure cost to a non-friend. So if the value of the gift expenses is sufficiently high, then only friend will give, and non-friend won't give. So in this way, we can just tell friends from the non-friend by a signaling mechanism. It means the gift here is a signal. So actually, we just if the IRSA condition can be fulfilled, then we have a separating perfect Bayesian equilibrium. So if the gift value is higher than a threshold, then only friend will give a gift and non-friend will not give. And we just share risk with the people who can give a gift above this threshold. And that explains why the gift expenses in China is very high. So actually there's a gift competition. They compete with a non-friend who has incentive to pretend to be a friend. And in this way, we try to introduce some interesting patterns, of course, compared to the second best without gift, the welfare is improved. And we would like to illustrate, like, even compared to the first best case, the ex-post efficiency of first best case is also same. The ex-post efficiency of the second best case with the gift is same to the first best case, because just assume like the friendship is a mutual relationship. I take you as a friend, you also take me as a friend. So in this case, I give you a gift, also I will receive a gift by same value. So actually there's no actual cost, but by this exchanging gift, people can share risk. So this is the amazing part of this mechanism. So without any actual cost, people can tell friend from non-friend and share risk. But this mechanism is not perfect. The imperfect part is like here. So in a group of friends, we say a pair of friends, if they're unequal in income or wealth, then actually the poor people will rely more on the risk sharing, on this mechanism. So actually the poor non-friend has more incentive or motivation to pretend to be friends. So they will spend more money on gift. And the poor friend will also have to compete and follow this increasing gift level. So actually the poor friend will spend more. And the rich friend, actually they will spend less because they have less incentive, or the competition pressure is less for them. So actually in a pair of friends, the rich one will spend less and poor one will spend more. So this is very conflicting with previous literature. Like if we just take gift as it's out of altruism, then of course the richer people will spend more on gift. But here we just show like in a pair of friends, the rich people will spend less and poor people will spend more. So actually this is the basic conclusions of the model part, and we would like to offer some empirical patterns, empirical evidence to support this mechanism, this argument. And this empirical study is based on a unique database we collected in rural China. So actually, this database is on 26 natural villages and covering 800 households. So actually, in this database, this is a census type database. So actually, everyone is covered, and we asked a lot of questions, especially about gift. So we have for 55 households, we have every item of gift received for 10 years because of this one. So this one is called gift book. So actually, the people have a tradition to record every item of gift received. So actually, for this 55 households, we can have a network. So we know every item of gift received and gift giving. So based on this database, we would like to test 3 hypotheses to find some empirical evidence to support this story, this argument. So first one is the gift giving has a positive effect on risk sharing. So if I spend more on gift, it means I have more. I can have more friends. Of course, I can share risk better than the others. And the second one is we would like to provide some evidence to the signaling function of gift expenses. That is quite difficult because in general it's very hard to identify a signal model. But here we just try to divide the gift because we have every item of gift value, gift received for 10 years. So actually we have a very big database. And then we would like to identify some gift is very likely to be taken as a signal. And for the others, maybe just to follow the social norm. So actually we try to identify the effect of signal gain, a signal gift on the risk sharing. And then we would like to provide some further evidence to identify this mechanism and rule out some competing interpretations. So for the first hypothesis, we would like to argue like if people spend more on gift expenses, the probability of sharing risk is also increasing. So in this database, we can identify some events which can cause some cash shortage. We just take it we say it's a problem or it's a events can cause borrowing and lending. So if they suffer from some natural disasters or so the house is on fire. So in this case, they would like to borrow, and we would like to see if the people who spend more money on gift can be more likely to borrow money from the others. And from the regression, we can see a very significant positive effect. So actually, they just I mean, the gift expenses increase the possibility of getting help from the others. And for the second hypothesis, actually, we divide all the gift into 5 groups. And we would like to see for the highest, we just focus on the highest value gift expenses. So we would like to see if people who receive a lot of high value gifts, and will they like to offer more help when the others need the help. And actually, we just use a variable like the days offered to friends in the busy season. So actually, in the busy season, people have to, I mean, in the rural area, there's so many busy seasons. And in the busy season, they have to finish the job in a very limited time. So actually, every family needs the other's help. And in this case, if the people who receive a lot of, we say, signal gift, then maybe they're willing to offer more help to the others. And from the regression, we can see the top line is the share people receive the highest value gift over total gift received. So actually, if the share is increasing, then it's more likely they provide more help to the others in the busy season, actually in the expenses of their own business. So that also provides some evidence to the argument we make. And the third one could be, I mean, about the last conclusion of the model. I mean, the poor people will spend more, and less people, rich people will spend less. So actually, from this regression, we can see if the gap between the gift receiver and gift giver is larger, then the gift receiver, then the gift giver is less likely to provide more gift, or actually they provide a low value gift. So actually, this empirical evidence also provides some support to the argument of the model. So this is the general idea of the paper. So I think I used too much time, right? Yeah. No, it's okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. I thought it was really interesting to read, especially because it's nice to think about this context of gift exchange, but then Ruixin, is that pronounced correctly?
Yes.
Adds a lot of context, a lot of evidence on this actual concept and the existence of these concepts in China, which was really nice to read. And that's first of all. And then he has also this data that he's using from that same context. So I love that. So I'm not going to summarize because it's a short presentation. So the thing that I'm struggling with a little bit is that how can we see, you're thinking about this in terms of, you're trying to find a solution for this limited commitment in terms of a non-repeated gain. And I'm struggling with thinking about gift giving in terms of a non-repeated gain, especially because you're talking about some 26 villages where people are really tightly knit, which you describe, they interact within. So I find that a little bit difficult. And then you're using a data set where this is the same, where these people are interacting over time consistently, and you have data of 10 years where you see them interacting. So that's what I find a little bit challenging. So, and I think if you really want to think about this one-shot gift giving, then you would need to think about another context. But I think that it's not necessary to do that with your data and with your question. Because what I think I have a little bit of an idea how you could think about this in a repeated interaction. You could get similar results, but then basically thinking about this in terms of types. Because you're also distinguishing altruism and friends. But if we just think about people who are more altruistic and less altruistic, or not so altruistic, then gift giving in a repeated context, I think, could also be a signaling story, where what we know from Foster and Rosenzweig's paper is that altruism significantly improves the commitment and risk sharing. So if you think of this as two types, where high altruistic people might be signaling that they're highly altruistic and having them, and they want to team up with other high altruistic people, then they are able to self-select in the same way that, for example, in Batak papers is happening. So they team up with the other high altruistic, whereby the low altruistic or non-altruistic have to team up with each other to share risk. But since risk sharing there is problematic in that group, there might not be a lot of risk sharing going on. And then you have a repeated game, and I think then you could also show the separating equilibrium, where you have high levels of risk sharing with people with high altruism, and this is then indicated in your game by the signaling of this gift. And then you have this other group which is not doing that. And I think, if I'm not wrong, I think this fits with all your hypotheses. Because the first one is average gift expenses in last period can increase the probability of risk sharing, so that definitely holds in that context. So people are just more altruistic, give more. The second one is the same, is the other way around, but the same way. And you could then also think about how that works in terms of wealth. And that is something that you would have to think through. But still, we know, and that's a little bit what I'm struggling with, this isn't a way to look at this data. But another thing is that we know that risk sharing in these communities happens between everyone. We also know simultaneously, based on Atanasio and Abigail Barr's paper, that people do create smaller risk sharing groups within larger risk sharing. So it might be possible, but if it's not possible, then an alternative explanation is a patron-client story, which fits very much with what you observe in terms of wealthy and non-wealthy people. And I think this could also still hold where people in good times, who know that they're sophisticated, that they're not time consistent, who are credit constrained or saving constrained, they give gifts to the rich people, and there's a competition, could also be a competition going on for the credit market that's created not by external credit, but by richer people in that community. And I think that could also explain your hypotheses. So what I was thinking in terms of your data is, might you, because you can all solve this whole problem, I think, if you have data on how people are actually friends. And I think there are several ways you can do that. Because you have this 10-year data, you have repeated interactions on how people are giving to each other, so that introduces an indicator. If people are neighbors, if people have similar names and other ways, you can show that it's actually this friendship that is coming into it, which might help if you see that also in addition to the extent of gift that they give. That's it, I think. Yeah. I have a couple of other things, but maybe we can talk later. Yeah? You want to?
So thanks very much. I think this is the difficult part to make this paper because even though we can provide some empirical evidence, still we can explain in different ways about this empirical evidence. So it's somehow hard just based on this database, even though this database already offer a lot of information, but still it's hard to rule out all the competing interpretations. So this is the problem, I should say. Yeah.
You could do a lab experiment.
Yeah.
You really have that.
That's true. That's true.
Non-repeated interaction.
Yeah.
And then you could also do a lab experiment, like this gentleman was suggesting, where you have a repeated interaction, and then you can see.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Yeah.
I think, as she said that there is some many alternative hypotheses, so many alternative hypotheses. For example, if people get a gift, they are more likely to get altruistic. And another concern that, for example, I identify he is my friend, then why should I provide gifts anymore? Because once I identified him, my friends, then it's okay. No
Exactly.
Default to.
Exactly. Actually, this is a question actually has been asked for several times. If you have identified the friends, then it's not necessary to keep on giving gifts, right? But actually, what I suggest is such kind of gift expense is not. If in a very stable village, maybe the gift expenses is not so high in this way. But actually, people are changing, especially consider people migrate out and then come back. So people are changing. So actually, the gift giving is somehow to signal I'm still your friend. So this relationship is still there, and then we can share risk.
I think that variation is really useful if you can find the gift giving is really often occurring in such an environment where migration is
Exactly. Yeah,
and that we support
that's true.
there.
That's true. Yeah.
Similar question. So I have data on gift food in Malawi is like 10%, so I was quite surprised. It seems quite similar. But what I did was to plot on the life cycle, and at old age, it doesn't budge. It's like it's 10% throughout life. You have 10 years, and I wonder if anything that happened in those 10 years make these guys be less valuable for the network, like they lose income, they get hurt, they lose a job, their son gets a good job. And once you have given those changes, you can probably see how gift exchange change, and then gives you an idea whether the value for these people have been in the network is, whether they've done anything like that. Do they change over time? That's my question.
I should say, I mean, the relationship is somehow stable. Especially they would like to sustain a very stable relationship. Especially like for the people they migrate outside. So actually they care about the people who left over in the village, like the elderly or children. So actually if they need others, they would like to keep a very with a stable relationship with each other. So I mean for this 10 years, actually we only have gift level data. So we only have gift because it's the gift book, we have a gift book for 10 years. But actually for the other information, we only have 4 years. So actually somehow it's a little bit difficult to identify everyone's behavior, even though it's a census type database. It's still hard to identify that. But what we can identify is the events can cause the cash shortage. So in this sense, it can help us to identify the people who need help. So that's the only one we can get. No, it's increasing. It's increasing for everywhere. Increasing with income. Actually, the speed of the growth rate of gift expenses is much higher than the income rise. The growth of income rise. So that's the case in China. Actually, that's another paper. For why this increasing speed is much higher than the income rise speed. Yeah.
But is that observation is consistent with your risk sharing problem? Because if people get more money, then they can self-insure. Then the demand for risk sharing going to be decreased. Then the gift should be decreased.
Yeah, I think it's changing. So actually, it's not so significant in this informal network, but actually in informal network, we say the mutual insurance group. When people get richer, they have less incentive to stay in this group. That's what we observe in Chinese data. Yeah.
So another thing I was wondering about with your data is that you have this nice gift giving.
Yeah.
So, but how sure are you, like in the cases where there's actually an emergency, I would assume that the gift giving nature is a little bit different, right?
Exactly.
Because what you mention in the paper is that everything is recorded based on ceremonies.
Yeah.
How much do you think there's underreporting of, especially if you think about the wealthier people that might actually be giving in the cases when there are actual shocks? Then how much do you think that's underreported?
Yeah. So that's the point. Actually, I can take it as two questions. First one is actually the nature of gift in China is somehow different from the other countries. So for the other countries, like Famchang's paper, they say this is a quasi credit. It means gift can be taken as a way of risk sharing. So I just give a gift when you have some problems. But actually in China it's totally different because they just give on the ceremonies, and on ceremonies you don't know that. So like in this paper, the gift giving is in last year. And the events can cause cash shortage just to happen in this year. So actually they have no idea in future I will have some certain problems. And for the underreport issue, I should say, I mean, the reason they record this gift is to, I mean, in the future they would like to pay back. So like in similar events they can give a similar give a gift by similar value. So actually the reason is different from what you think. So in this sense, I think won't be underreported. because they don't know this survey, and they try to record everything for themselves rather than for us. Yeah. Thank you.
I don't think the mic is working, right? Can you? I'm no longer muted, I guess. So, well, I hope you can understand. If not, then I'll stay here permanently. Okay, good afternoon. I'll take you back to more of an African context now, and what I'll talk about today is in strategic positioning in rotating savings and credit associations, so-called Roscas. And what we're trying to do in this paper is we're actually trying to investigate whether positioning or the choice of position that I want to have or that I will exercise within the savings group is something that is potentially motivated by an insurance motive, which is also something that is somewhat underexplored in the economics literature, because if we think about Roscas, we mostly think of them about a tool for self-commitment, or to overcome self-commitment problems, or as a tool for investment. And our research is pretty much work in progress, so we do appreciate comments on the idea. However, I do not have empirical data to show you yet at this stage, because we actually wanted to do a lab and field experiment, but we had to postpone this for change in government, elections, terrorist attacks, and we have to do it sometime soon. This is joint work with Jean-Marie Ballon and Catherine Goettinger, who are also at the University of Namur. And counter to probably a lot of the research nowadays, this is actually very much motivated by observations in the anthropological literature which go back to the 1960s. And the main mechanism that we think about here has been described by Shirley Ardiner, who is an anthropologist here in Oxford, and it can be summarized as follows, and I'll read. The traditional social obligations to help kinsmen quickly come into effect as word gets around among members of the Rosca, who will adjust the order of rotation to enable the unlucky one to receive a turn. The speed with which Roscas can usually react to their members' needs can rarely be matched by distant, impersonal banking systems. Some members are not prepared, even prefer not to take an early term, even when no direct financial dividend is given to late takers. They may prefer the element of insurance which waiting provides. And this waiting is actually something that is rather counterintuitive if we think about sort of this investment motive that has been very prominent in the literature. Now, why do we think that this is still interesting to look at? Well, again, going back to sort of the 1960s, Clifford Geertz said that Roscas would be somewhat of a middle rung to development. So as we see financial markets expanding, we should actually see Roscas disappearing. Now, if we look at sort of current rates of formal saving in bank accounts and sort of informal saving, we see that, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, saving in these sort of informal groups is still very much prevalent. Even so, I mean, for those of you who travel to Africa regularly, you see EcoBank popping up on all sorts of corners. At least I feel that. So the question is, well, why do we not see this like replacement? Why are still people holding on to these Roscas or to saving informally? And maybe can this insurance function explain some of the persistence, or is there a certain degree of complementarity? Just very briefly, and I think most of you are familiar with the principle of these Roscas. So basically, in very simple terms, and it has different variations, but we think about a group of people that meets regularly every week or every month. They put in a certain amount of money in one common pot, like 10 euros, and you have 12 members. At the end of the meeting, you have 120 euros that will then basically be given to one of the members at the time. There's different ways these pots can be distributed, so typically we think of lottery draws, or the order of rotation is assigned already previously, so at the start of sort of a Rosca circle. Or you do have bidding Roscas, which are basically Roscas where the pot is auctioned off. So the person who has the highest need will actually bid for the pot at the time. And then we'll get the pot, and the others will basically be compensated through his bidding value. And so far in the economics literature, Roscas have been pretty much rationalized by market failures. And sort of in seminal work, Tim Baisley and colleagues have said that while people participate in Roscas, or the reasons why these Roscas are there is because they allow investment in a durable good much earlier than one you would save in autarky. Now, following this line of reasoning would also mean that actually if you are the person who receives the pot of money last, you would do as well as you would save in autarky. So you would actually rather drop out of the Rosca and not stay in. Another stream of the literature has looked at Roscas as sort of a self-commitment device, but there has been comparatively very little research, at least from an economics perspective, looking at this potential insurance function of Roscas. So it is somewhat there. It has been theoretically modeled by Stefan Klanner, and what he has shown is that if we have a bidding Rosca, we would find a situation where basically the pot would be allocated to the highest bidder, and that would be an optimal outcome. However, if we are not having this bidding mechanism, and in most of the Roscas that are existent in sub-Saharan Africa, compared to the Asian context, we actually do have lottery draws or a pre-allocation, this explanation would actually not hold. Now, in the anthropological literature, again, what we do find is we find very many descriptions that say that if the order of rotation is alterable, and I can change my place with somebody within sort of the group, even so I'm not pre-assigned that position, then I actually kind of have this insurance function, and it allows for some sort of strategic behavior. And Brink and Chavez, for example, have been observing this in Cameroon in particular, and have been sort of the ones that have been suggesting the strategic behavior to take place. Now, you might think that it's somewhat odd that we kind of come up with this idea. What we do think, or what we did find in the literature, in the economics literature, when we had studies, or when we could identify studies that looked at position preference, is actually that we found a lot of studies that indicate an overwhelming part of the participants that said that they would want to wait and actually have the pot at the end, which is very much counter to what you would suggest if it's for an investment motive. You would want to see very many people saying, I want the money early, like save cash. But we have studies in Benin, for example, where they've asked people if they could choose their position, when would they want the money, and they show that it's about 60% that prefer to go to the end compared to 24 in the beginning. In Cameroon, it's 47% versus 24. In Ethiopia, in small ICUBs, it's 85%. In South Africa, we have evidence for about 42%. And now you might think, okay, this is very particular to the sub-Saharan African context. However, sort of in our home turf in Belgium, study about within a migrant population that are also using Roscas in Brussels in particular have shown that even there 42% still prefer to wait for the money and not actually, and nobody really wanted or stated a clear preference for the beginning. So it's somewhat puzzling. Now what we try to do in this paper is we try to provide a very basic theoretical model to explain this empirical regularity of some sort, which we do find puzzling, and we want to see to what extent actually insurance motives might be able to explain that preference. So what we have so far is we have a basic model that shows that going last is preferred only if uncertainty or a shock falls within a certain range. At very small likelihoods of shocks occurring, you would always prefer to go first. And we also have, and it also indicates that risk-averse and more patient individuals would prefer to come to the end. So this is somewhat less surprising. And then we have some qualitative evidence which we've collected actually in preparation for our planned field study, which does confirm the importance of exchange and that Roscas are sort of a means to go to if you have experienced a shock. And I'll come to that towards the end. I will briefly talk you through the model, but I will not show you sort of like all the main mechanisms of the model and the perfect solution. So we have a setup where we have two players that are participating in a Rosca over 2 periods. Each player has a wealth W and contributes an amount X to the Rosca in every period. we have a player facing a shock S with a known probability, and we have the pot that is basically allocated to you, which can offset the shock or will be consumed within the period. So we're assuming no savings. So it's really sort of very much stylized facts here. For sort of purpose of illustration, I'm assuming that player 1 receives the pot in period 1, and when players are facing the shocks, they can demand to change places. Now, sort of our full state of the worlds can be described in 4 scenarios. So player 1 receives the pot in period 1, but player 2 has the shock. We have player 1 receiving the pot in period 1, and both players have a shock. We have player 1 receiving the pot in period 1, and only she has a shock, and we have no shock at play. Now, our results are symmetrical also if player 2 would receive the pot first, so I'm only kind of illustrating it on that sort of side. So what we'll do first is we want to establish whether exchange is taking place when we assume exchange to take place. And what we do is we look at expected utilities under exchange and no exchange, and we compare this for each player and see whether they would exchange or prefer to exchange versus non-exchange. And what we see is that we arrive at a certain condition under which player 1 and 2 would prefer exchange, and for player 1, if we assume that he is risk averse, we basically see that the more patient and the larger the likelihood of a shock, the more likely he will be to exchange his place. And we see for player 2 that basically we arrive at a condition that will always be satisfied. So player 2 who is experiencing the shock will always want to exchange. So what we can establish, at least sort of mathematically, that exchange will take place under these conditions. So under our 4 different scenarios, the only scenario where we will have a change in places, which seems pretty obvious, is the one where we have one player having a shock and the other one getting the pot. And in all other cases, obviously when you're faced with the shock yourself or when there's no shock, there will also be no exchange. So that's not surprising. Now, sort of taking this a step further, because we are assuming that we actually do have an ex-ante preference for coming last. So we'll look at our expected utilities taking into consideration the likelihood of each of the 4 scenarios happening. And if we do that, and if we basically solve our system of equations then, so we're trying to compare whether the expected utility of being last is higher than the expected utility of being first, and under which situation that would be the case, we basically arrive at a function which looks like the blue line. So the blue line here is the solution to the previous slide as a function of p, the likelihood of a shock, and I hope this does a bit illustrate what I'm trying to get to, at least much more than having a whole set of symbols only. And what you do see is that if the likelihood of a shock, is very, very small, actually you would always prefer to be first. Only if the likelihood of a shock falls within a certain range, so here from, let's say, 0.05 till 0.005 to 0.05, somewhere about here, you would actually prefer to be second. Now, what is interesting about sort of this shape and the decision is that this decision, or sort of the shape of our condition, is influenced by 2 scenarios happening. And it's the scenario whether both people have a shock or none of the people face a shock, and how likely those 2 cases will actually take place. So the situation where either one player would have a shock is actually not playing out, it's totally cancelling out. Now, one thing also to kind of take into consideration, obviously the shape of our functions will be sensitive to the degree of patience that I'm assuming. So if I'm sort of less patient, then sort of my area will be smaller, and I'll say if I'm more risk averse, then I'm obviously also much more likely to go second than go first, right? Okay. Now, the idea was that based on sort of our theoretical predictions and at least sort of on this idea of having a certain range within which shocks would happen, we would take this to the field and test to what these predictions would hold. We're not able to do that yet. So what we have managed to do so far is to conduct semi-structured qualitative interviews in Ouagadougou in preparation for our fieldwork, where we in very much detail discuss why people participate in Roscas, why they have a certain preference, and how it interacts with sort of the formal financial services that are available to them. And at least what we have from our qualitative data is that these observations that have been made in the 60s in the anthropological literature still seem to somewhat hold. So change in Roscas and in position is possible, and it's something that is very, very frequent. And it's only granted if you have a negative shock. So if people said that they have an investment opportunity, actually they were not allowed to change their positions. But for example, if you say that your mom is sick and you need to go to the village to visit her, you're actually granted to get the money much earlier, and you're actually allowed to change positions. We also see that there's some sort of correlation or suggested correlation with risk aversion. So people that are more risk averse are much more preferring the end. So one statement to illustrate, one woman said, I would say I'm chicken-hearted for reasons of prudence. I prefer to take the last place. It's been my position every year. I will stick to it. You never know what happens. For people, in contrast to that, for people that said that they want to go first and that they always prefer to have their money early, so we have one Rosca which consists of market women, and they were very strict, saying, okay, I either want to be first, second, or third. If I'm not third, I basically prefer not to participate anymore. And for them, it's basically to make large investments and buy tissue for money and then kind of run their business for the rest of the period. So in summary, what we have so far is we have model and case study evidence to suggest that more risk-averse individuals prefer to wait and take a late turn, which is in line with sort of what we have suggested in the anthropological literature. We see in our model that if the probability is small, that you will incur a shock. So if you're living in a very certain environment, you're much more likely to go first. If you're living in a very uncertain environment, you're much more likely to wait, which is kind of intuitive evidence on this potential insurance motive or mechanism to be present. And yeah, what we'll try to do and what we'll hopefully do pretty soon is do data collection well, we might change our location because we wanted to do it in Burkina and it was a bit too tricky given all the changes, so we'll actually do it in Kenya now. And then we'll hopefully find confirmation or refutation of our theoretical predictions, and we'll expand on our model because so far as it is very stylized, we'll relax the homogeneity assumptions and vary probability of the shock and also allow for multiple membership because that's something that we see. So I will stop here because I run out of time. Thank you very much.
So I just give a few comments. I think it's quite interesting question, actually. Research question is quite interesting because it's actually a surprise to me. I mean, you say according to anthropology literature, the people prefer to take the part later than earlier. But actually, it's still a little bit confusing to me. I mean, based on the model, you say there's several scenarios, and I can fully understand. Like in one scenario, like if I stand before the second stage, and given there's no any shock in the first stage, of course I prefer to change. That is no problem. But actually, I was thinking like if I stand before the two stages, and what I should do is just to make a trade-off between, to hedge the risk in the first stage or the second stage. So that's the only thing I should do. And always I think the first stage will be preferred because the expected utility should be discounted in the second stage. So always I will prefer to choose earlier than later. So that's my first intuition when I think about this question. So I think maybe it's better to put more effort on intuition part. Link the intuition with the mathematics. So that's the first thing I suggest. And then to explain why people prefer to take the part later than earlier, I was thinking maybe there could be some interesting extension or some other reasons. One thing is like in this paper, the probability of shock is actually independent over stages. So I think maybe it's better to just assume some correlation between this. It's possible, like the probability of shock is just correlated. And second thing, maybe we can find some behavioral reasons for this pattern. I believe this pattern exists. So I was thinking like maybe other than your interpretation, maybe some behavioral reason for that. For example, like in China, there's a saying like so the good things never come together, but the bad things will never come alone. So that is maybe one reason I just wait until the worst case. So maybe there are some other reasons for this interesting behavior. And also I think, of course, if there's some data to support the argument, could be great. And also like I was wondering like who will prefer later than earlier. I mean, maybe not everyone. So actually, maybe just a few people and with some special features. So I was thinking maybe it's interesting to see the personality traits or something. And also like I was thinking to compare to some Chinese case, because in China there's also some mutual insurance group. I don't know if it's really similar or comparable to Roscas. I have no idea, but I think it's somehow interesting to compare a case, because from the field experience, my field experience on this mutual insurance group, I didn't see any such kind of case like to take the part. I mean, later than earlier. Always they prefer like, or indifferent, or prefer to take it earlier. So that's why I think it's quite interesting if you can really explain this pattern. Yeah. So that's all.
I'll respond quickly to your questions, and then if anybody else has something to adjust. Yes, so thank you very much for your comments. I think you're totally right. It definitely needs an extension with respect to linking the probability of a shock. I think that's a good one. Also, hedging risk or looking for an outside option, because I mean also self-insurance might be an outside option, which we're not considering because we're not assuming any savings for now. With respect to alternative explanations, I actually do have a couple of alternative explanations in mind myself, which are not coming from Burkina Faso, but other contexts where people basically seem to signal a certain degree of debt aversion. So they don't want to be indebted, and actually it would probably give us a similar kind of scenario. So if I feel I have to contribute every term, if I take the money early, then I'm still indebted for the terms which I have to contribute till the cycle closes. So that might be an alternative one. With respect to who prefers to be last, we do have some household survey data from Burkina Faso, from earlier studies and from Cameroon, but we don't have very good sort of parameters on time preferences, and that's why I was not showing them, but why we're not using them yet. What we see there is that it is indeed certain kinds of people who do prefer to go to the end. So in that data, we also see that if you're sort of more risk averse, you tend to go to the end. We see that it tends to be more women compared to men, for example. We see it stronger in rural contexts than in urban ones. Comparing it with mutual insurance groups, it's an interesting one, actually. I didn't find much evidence on sort of China, Roscas in China, because they seem to work a bit different, but I will definitely look into that. So thanks for that.
So I thought one of the most interesting things you sort of said in passing, if you have a negative shock, you can get moved forward, but if you have an investment opportunity, you can't. I mean, that sounds like a poverty trap to me right there. And I think it would be really nice if you can, another reason to delay is that you don't actually know what you should do with the money, and you're hoping you get a good idea or a good investment opportunity comes along. And I think it would be really nice if you could try to distinguish between this insurance motive versus I'm trying to find, I don't know what to do with this money that would actually be, I mean, sort of implicit in this notion that we won't let you move up if you have a good investment opportunity is that we don't really think it's a good investment opportunity. Mm-hmm. We think you're going to invest the money in something, but it's not actually going to change your life, which is very contrary to the way we as economists think about credit constraints and the functions of Roscas. And so it's fine if it's just a story about insurance, but I think to the extent that you could separate this insurance motive from what opportunities and returns people actually face, and see whether the fact that people are delaying because they don't have insurance and foregoing starting opportunities that are profitable is really costing people in aggregate. I think that would be really nice.
Yeah. Hi, that was really interesting. It looks like to me you're assuming a Rosca is a risk-free financial intermediary. And yet, and I guess it depends on how long the Rosca's been going and how long the members have been together. But in some cases, members can default. They might not show up because they don't have the money to put into that Rosca that month or week or whenever it is. And so I wondered if you're going to include that. If I think you're not going to pay, then I might put you near the end, or not let you move up or whatever. And I don't know if that's related to the investment issue that was just mentioned.
Yeah, should I take one more and then respond?
Yeah, it's a little bit related, but it's more in terms of if you have these groups, you're assuming that there's some risk heterogeneity, and there's a paper which shows also that there is heterogeneity in these Roscas. It's a perfect context for insurance, but why not on the side? Why would you assume that these people trust in each other enough and that there's sufficient commitment within that group to establish those savings and this credit? So why would it matter at what point you are if for an insurance purpose? And I'm not saying it isn't, but I just think that that's something to think about.
Okay, I'll start with you, Pamela. So indeed, there is potential for the poverty trap, fully agree. We've been thinking about that also, and sort of in the lab we were actually trying to, or we will try to illustrate both cases. So actually whether you would move for an insurance purpose, whether you would allow changes, and to what extent under varying degrees of uncertainty. So we've actually kind of already had this in mind, but we haven't integrated it in the model yet because we first wanted to see what we could get in terms of data and when we will finally be able to do what we planned. Then with respect to Roscas being risky, yes, they are risky. For the ones that we looked at right now, or for at least for the ones where we did have qualitative evidence, those people have been together for 10, even 20 years. So they've been established for quite a long time. For Roscas that are much more motivated by sort of an investment motive right from the start, so which have been formed among groups of commerçants or traders or certain trades, we do see that there is much higher risk of default within or of certain members compared to sort of women groups or sort of smaller Roscas that save smaller amounts much more often. So yes, there's certainly this evidence or direction, and we'll have some. Hopefully, we will have some sort of institutional information on that, but I'm not quite sure on how. Well, it will probably be integrated in sort of a lab experiment through different risky environments that we will portray, but I don't quite know on what to do with it yet, but I will definitely think about it. And yes, your comment fully taken, and definitely.
You could have a game quickly where you have a lot of side payments and not, right? That would be really,
yeah, sort of what we had in mind for our lab experiment is already quite elaborate. I'm not sure on how many more games we can incorporate, but well, yeah, maybe it will be 2 experiments actually, but yeah, definitely it'll have to be something like that. But thanks a lot for your comments.
Okay, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Before I begin, I know my 3-year-old daughter is watching in Washington, so hi, Anya. This is joint work with Uttara Balakrishnan, who's a grad student at the University of Maryland, and Johannes Haushofer. So the motivation for this paper, this is a behavioral economics paper. So the motivation is, as many of you are, I'm sure, familiar, there's a long literature on how we should model intertemporal trade-offs. So the canonical model of intertemporal discounting in economics is the discounted utility model. This is exponential discounting. So the idea is that a dated payment that you're going to receive t periods from now is discounted by a factor delta to the t. And what this means is that if I'm making a choice between a payment that occurs at time t versus a payment that occurs at time t plus k, all that matters are the amounts in question and k. T does not matter. So this front-end delay that occurs before any of the payments shouldn't matter in terms of the trade-offs that I make. This is the canonical model. It was first proposed by Samuelson, but even Samuelson, when he proposed it, didn't think that this was a good positive description of how human beings make intertemporal trade-offs. So he says it is completely arbitrary to assume that the individual behaves so as to maximize an integral of the form envisaged. Nonetheless, economists have adopted this model, and until the second half of the 20th century, it was gaining wide use without a lot of questioning. But in fact, psychological evidence has mounted that this is not a good representation of how human beings and even animals make intertemporal trade-offs. So the front-end delay does seem to matter. And when we think about experimentally elicited discount factors, discount rates, they depend on how far, what the time horizon considered is. They don't seem to be constant per period over time. And we also observe what we call static preference reversals, where I may prefer to be patient if I'm thinking about 2 payoffs that occur in the future, but I may look much less patient and want to speed up my consumption if I'm able to get my earliest payoff immediately. And this led to the formulation of models of present bias, the most widely used in economics being the quasi-hyperbolic or beta-delta discounting model that was first proposed by Phelps and Pollock, but adapted for economists by David Leibson, Matt Rabin, and Ted O'Donoghue. We care about this from a development perspective because quasi-hyperbolic agents don't carry out their plans. And in particular, they tend to overconsume relative to the long-run optimum goods that have benefits, immediate benefits and future costs, like consumption of alcohol or fatty foods. And they tend to underinvest in things that are costly in the short term and have benefits in the future, like savings and education. So from a policy perspective, if agents are present bias matters a lot because we can improve their welfare by offering them commitment devices and helping to de-bias them about their time and consistent preferences. Now, unfortunately, within the experimental economics literature, this whole body of work documenting present bias has recently been called into question. And people have come to believe, many behavioral economists have come to believe that, in fact, people may not be present biased when it comes to money trade-offs. And so there are sort of theoretical and experimental reasons that this body of work has been called into question. So the theoretical reason here is that since utility is defined over consumption and not money, even if individuals are present biased, if they have access to credit markets and they're not liquidity constrained, they shouldn't make present biased choices over money, because the timing of your money payouts should not influence your optimal consumption stream. So the evidence from experiments that appeared to show present bias over money shouldn't have been there if agents were present biased over consumption but had access to credit markets. Now, at the same time, there's a concern that many experimental designs have been confounded, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the biggest issues is that introducing, allowing people to choose between immediate and delayed payoffs often also means differences in terms of transaction costs and uncertainty across immediate versus delayed payoffs. And that's a reason that you may look present biased even if you aren't actually. And so there have been a number of recent studies, most notably Andreoni and Sprenger's work in the AER, that try to equalize transaction costs across and uncertainty across immediate and delayed payouts and find no evidence of present bias. So this whole model of hyperbolic discounting has been called into question. So what we're going to do in this study is we're going to address a problem in this new body of work, which is that in many contexts, equalizing transaction costs and uncertainty involves introducing a small front-end delay. And so that may in turn be another potential confound in interpreting results. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a lab experiment designed to measure intertemporal trade-offs in a setting where we can equalize transaction costs and uncertainty while across immediate and delayed payouts while using the same payment modality with the same level of uncertainty by exploiting Kenya's mobile money technology. So what we're going to do is a standard behavioral economic experiment using what's called a convex time budget that's going to allow us to address, to sort of use the cutting edge in terms of experimental methodology and address a lot of the confounds, but making immediate payouts using the same modality, mobile money modality that we do for delayed payouts as well. And when we do this, when we bring immediate payouts back into cutting-edge experiments measuring intertemporal trade-offs, we do in fact find significant evidence of present bias. We find estimated beta parameters in the range of 0.9 to 0.94. And we're going to be able to show that this is not driven by confounds of liquidity constraints that have been a concern because we have a population with a lot of variability in liquidity constraints. But we'll show that many of the things that exist in the literature as suggested confounds, like risk aversion and background consumption, are important, and they drive our results closer towards reducing the observed level of present bias. So while we see a significant level of present bias, it's not enormously large, and that's going to have important policy implications as well. So let me talk very briefly. So the standard approach to measuring intertemporal trade-offs for a long time has been what's called the multiple price list. And the idea is that I'm going to ask subjects to make a series of choices where I first ask you, would you prefer $10 today or $10 tomorrow? Okay, how about $10 today or $11 tomorrow? And I keep going down this list. Eventually, most people are going to start by saying, I'd like $10 today, and they're going to switch towards the amount of money tomorrow as it gets higher and higher. And the point is, your switch point, if you assume linear utility and no uncertainty, your switch point is going to identify the interval that contains your discount factor. But there's a problem with this, of course, because you need to assume linear utility. So we're going to use a different methodology called the convex time budget experiment. The convex time budget experiment is just going to convexify this choice set. So the idea is that you have a budget, an early payout date valued budget that you divide between the fraction of the budget you want at the earlier date and the fraction that you want at the later date, instead of choosing the whole amount early or the whole amount late. And as in the decisions we're seeing here, what we have is an interest rate, just as you do in these binary choices, we have an interest rate that's going to make delaying some of your payment attractive. Now, what's important about the convex time budget is that, first of all, we get more information per decision because we get, ignoring error, we're going to get an exactly most preferred point in that continuous space and not just an interval. But it's also going to simultaneously allow us to estimate the curvature of the utility function along with beta and delta, given the right set of decisions. And it's going to create a direct test of the hypothesis that decisions could be driven by liquidity constraints or arbitrage, because if people are arbitraging, then they're going to choose points at the end lines of the budget set, whereas if people are making decisions based on their preferences, they're typically going to be choosing interior points. So we're going to do a convex time budget experiment. We're going to do 48 decisions for each individual subject, presented in 8 decision sets, where the decision sets vary in terms of the front-end delay, 0, 14, or 28 days, the delay between payments, which is 14 or 28 days. Within each set, we're going to vary the gross interest rate, ranging from an interest rate of 10% to an interest rate of 300%, over a time span that's either 2 or 4 weeks. So these are very high interest rates, much higher than people could come up with on the market without risk. And they're going to be over large amounts. So we're going to do this in Nairobi, Kenya, with budget sets that are equivalent to between 2 and 4 times median daily expenditure. So the stakes are very large, and subjects had a lot of incentive to take these decisions seriously. So our subject pool, it's about 300 adult Kenyans. They're drawn from the subject pool of the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics in Nairobi. I only have 5 minutes. So we have a great interface that makes it really easy to make your decision. You use your finger to move this slider back and forth, and the amounts allocated to the earlier and later payments appear on this screen. And this gives us, it's a very intuitive interface. We also did standard multiple price lists using a similar simple interface. And what I'm going to show you is that subjects seem to understand the experiment very clearly. So importantly, we're going to equalize transaction costs and uncertainty by making all payments using M-Pesa, and payments that were received on the day of the experiment came to people's phones as they were leaving the experimental lab. But all of these subjects had experience with Busara, and 98% that they believed that they were all going to receive all payments on time. I'm going to skip over some of the other small details here. So the point is, most of our estimation is I'll show you a few reduced form results, but most of our estimation is basically going to be estimating these beta and delta parameters in a few different frameworks. These are your discounting parameters. Delta is your constant exponential discount factor. If beta is less than 1, that indicates present bias. Beta equal to 1, this reduces to exponential discounting. I'm not going to show you all of the estimation. The details are in the paper. This follows directly from Andreoni and Springer. We have a few different ways to do this, some of which allow us to control for individual heterogeneity in background consumption. So the first thing I'll show you is this. If we just pool decisions with a front-end delay of 0 versus a front-end delay greater than 0, what we see is that subjects allocate a larger fraction of their budget to the immediate payout when the front-end delay is 0, and it's a significant difference. You can see this. This is another way of showing this across interest rates. The interesting thing here is that the effects are much more pronounced at the higher interest rates. This dark line is the fraction of the early valued budget that you allocate to earlier payment. And you can see that it's weakly higher across the board when the front-end delay is 0, but it's importantly higher, significantly higher at the higher gross interest rates. When we estimate the parameters of the model, you can see our beta estimates are here. These are all different specifications which range in terms of whether we're doing nonlinear least squares or Tobit based on the tangency condition, and whether we're estimating background consumption as a parameter or using self-reported expenditure data. Across the board, we consistently see that this is the hypothesis test we care about. Beta is less than 1. It's ranging from about 0.89 to about 0.94 across these specifications. We can do robustness checks out the wazoo. We can change utility from CRRA to CARA. We can do a falsification test where we look at other deviations from exponential discounting. We can restrict the sample to subjects who make consistent choices, who are consistent with rationality, who are consistent with the law of demand. None of these things seems to make our result go away. So very briefly, we see a lot of heterogeneity. We can also estimate these parameters at the individual level. And consistent with experimental studies of this type, we see an enormous amount of heterogeneity at the individual level in preferences, which is not very well explained by observables. So this is consistent with a lot of recent lab experiment results. Preference heterogeneity is important, but it's unobservable heterogeneity. It's not explained by as a linear function of demographics. But what we see that more than half the subjects have beta less than 1. It's about 60 to 40%. And subjects are much more likely to have a beta that's significantly less than 1 than significantly greater than 1. We also see a lot of heterogeneity in these estimated delta factors. And these are daily discount rates, so they're quite close to 1, but these aggregate up to annualized discount rates that range, that are enormous, basically. We see that this variation in these 3 parameters, you've got present bias, patience, and risk, is explained to some extent by observables, gender, age, but is not driven by the things that we would think are related to liquidity constraints, whether you have a regular job and whether you have actual liquid money in your bank account. So liquidity constraints is not what is driving this evidence of present bias. And then finally, I think I probably have almost no time. We can also look at whether it could be driven by arbitrage. So subjects wanting to go all in, because this is giving them an opportunity, looking patient at high interest rates, because this is giving them interest rates that aren't available outside of the lab. That would tell us that we couldn't interpret this as preferences. It's really about the the interest rates that are available to subjects. But we can refute that. What we see is that subjects who are not liquidity constrained, even at these very high interest rates, less than 40% of them, when they're not liquidity constrained, are investing everything in the delayed payout, which we would expect them to do if they were trying to exploit this high interest rate. So that's showing us that these experiments are revealing intertemporal preferences. They're not revealing things about the interest rates and the liquidity constraints that subjects faced. Okay, so I think I'm... Okay, so the point of the study is that we can sort of we can fix all of the problems that have been documented in the literature and have led people to question present bias, and fix an additional problem, that is the front-end delay that is often introduced when equalizing transaction costs, and we see that there is present bias. It's significant, though it's not enormous, and we see that it's not driven by liquidity constraints. It's not, choices in these experiments are not driven by arbitrage. And that importantly, that's not to say the criticisms of the existing literature are wrong. We find that risk aversion and background consumption do appear to be important things to control for, but they don't make present bias go away. And this exercise gives us parameter estimates that we could then use to think about how you would calibrate commitment devices if you wanted to actually speak to the policy literature. So I'll stop there. I know my discussant has a couple of comments, so thank you very much.
I'm not even sure whether it's worth putting up a slide with comments because I only have one slide. Let me see. So, I greatly enjoyed reading your paper, and even so I have hardly any clue about how to measure time preferences in the lab. I hope that some of the comments will still be useful to you to some extent. At least sort of from my perspective, it was greatly useful to read your paper. I really enjoyed it. I particularly also enjoyed the online appendix, which helped me change some of sort of the experiments that we have in mind going forward. I think the innovative and really nice thing about the paper is that you're using this M-Pesa technology to effectuate payments immediately to kind of reduce the front-end delay that you do see in Andreoni and Sprenger, who I think pay out at the end of the day, even further. And I think this is something really nice, really novel to the paper. However, kind of in general, I was very little surprised to find confirmation of present bias in the population study. This was actually what I would have expected. I mean, we're talking about a developing country. We're talking about people who are really make decisions on a daily basis. So they are kind of trained to do so because that's their daily life. So, I mean, I kind of following up on this, I was a bit sort of puzzled what would then be policy implications. And I mean, you hint to this in your presentation and also a little bit in the paper, but I'm really wondering on how much you can nudge people to overcome this present bias, because what you in essence would need to do is to provide an environment of a certain degree of certainty so that they would really do that. And it's not something that we can change with potentially one very small commitment device. It's something that probably comes from a whole set of things. So within sort of the whole, and this is probably more a general criticism to the whole experimental lab literature, I'm not quite sure on what to do with it, what we find. And I think what is interesting is, or what would be interesting for me, it would be, okay, given that you have the parameter estimate, how does this allow you to calibrate a certain policy? I think that would have been something that I would have quite liked to see for illustration purposes. Then towards the end of your paper, you do have an interesting section about sort of expansion, further research, and where does that lead us to, and sort of areas for which you want, or what you want to look at in the future. And there's two things I was thinking about that I felt I don't know enough about, and I haven't really seen much about it. And I mean, if I think about sort of the literature about risk preferences, there's a lot going on now which discusses whether risk preferences measured in the lab are stationary and stable. And some studies find that people report much more stable risk preferences based on surveys compared to sort of these lab experiments. And I was wondering actually whether there's some certain degree of, what can we say about stationarity or stability of these time preferences that we measure in the lab, and to what extent would that then basically confirm, calibrate, allow us to move on to sort of the policy implications? Because if those do change sort of in every lab experiments that you have, then I mean, what is sort of the general message to take away from this? And also a bit related to what to do with, or how do we nudge people into becoming less present biased? I was wondering to what extent there is interaction with sort of naivety bias, so knowing that you actually are realizing that you are present biased, and how well you can sort of predict this for yourself, and how this then sort of changes or affects your behavior. So as I said, I don't know anything about it. This is just suggestions, and I hope it's helpful. And I have two comments sort of a more technical note, which I didn't see in the paper and I thought might be interesting to mention. So you're using nonlinear least squares estimates to estimate your parameter values, and from what I know, they're quite sensitive to the starting values that you choose. No?
I mean, it doesn't matter.
Okay. So I was wondering whether they are robust to your starting values or not. And the other thing, when I was looking sort of at the screen, also the ones that you presented here, given that you have this bar, are people actually trying to allocate or make sort of allocations of the different budgets to kind of, let's say, clean values? So am I allocating 207 and 359, or am I allocating 200, 400, 300, 600? So would I rather have sort of somewhat stepwise functions, or do I really have a continuum? And if it would be more stepwise, I guess it might also affect the way you estimate your parameters, and I don't know whether that plays out for you and whether that's helpful. That's all for me.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. I think some of these things we can talk about. After. So I think one thing I should say is that, you know, not having time to go over the whole literature, is this surprising? Well, Mark Dean and Anya Sautman have a paper in Mali that's contributing to this literature showing no present bias. So in that sense, I think it's not the case that everyone who does this in Stanford and Berkeley finds no present bias, and everyone who does this in Africa finds present bias. In fact, we're seeing both results in university labs and in a whole increasingly broad range of field settings. And one of the things that we've been looking at, so in fact, part of what we've been doing, what we have in the field right now following up to this, is tracing out, okay, if you do it with a small front-end delay in this population with these interest rates, do we see a drop-off as we would expect if it's all about the small front-end delay, or is it something more about the population differences across studies, or the interest rates, or the exact framing of the experiment? So I think that's going to help us to sort of trace out exactly which of these things is what's mattering across these settings. But I think that you're raising an important point. So this notion of how stable are preferences, you know, I had an NSF rejected 5 years ago about trying to do these experiments over time, so I'm very sensitive to these points. One of the things I didn't have time to go into is that we see, so background consumption, how much money you basically think you have on a given day matters. It matters in terms of individual heterogeneity, and if we estimate a model with a representative agent, what we see is that subjects are systematically acting as though they have more background consumption in the future than today, even though that's not driven by day of the week effects or calendar effects or anything like that. What's interesting is that we can test in our data whether they're shifting money toward times when they expect to not have a lot of cash on hand, and we see that it's not driven by expectations about liquidity. It's something more psychological, and so I think part of what that points to is that when we think about how would you move from these this lab data to real policy implications, this is pointing to a way in which people are making intertemporal decisions that is not captured by our models well at all. People are moving money around, but not in the way that we as economists would expect toward times of greater liquidity scarcity. And so I think trying to understand that process and that sort of mental accounting across days is something that we haven't been focusing on, and this seems really important to us. I think this question of do people predict their own present bias, obviously in the commitment device literature, naivete is critical in terms of whether you think you understand the value of commitment devices or not. When we talk about policy implications, one of the things about this, though, is, I think David Leibson has started doing some work on this. When you have these levels of present bias that are there but not enormous, often the cases where a commitment device is going to work for you and really improve your welfare can be sort of knife-edge cases. And that's particularly true in low-income countries where we think about people who are self-employed. So you can't make a contract with your employer to save for you. And so I think the reason that experiments like this have policy implications is we actually need the right model of utility and the right parameters to think about the welfare benefits and how you should come up with things like commitment devices that can improve welfare if they're designed correctly, but if they're not actually designed with this theory in mind, we don't know that they're going to have any effect, or if so, that they have the potential to have big impacts on welfare, as we would hope they would. Step function, this interface we actually don't, so often if you ask people to write down an amount, you see that they are using multiples of 5, but with the touch screen, it's not true at all. And so it doesn't make more sense to do it as a discrete choice. But I take that point. I don't know do I have time for a couple? I'm supposed to be in charge, huh? I think I have time for a couple more questions if anyone has a question.
I think it's very interesting, but are you assuming people that don't have any savings? Because if people are sophisticated enough and they have savings, then they first maximize kind of lifetime income, and then they just allocate the consumption. If they are sophisticated enough, they can just maximize their total, lifetime income, and then just allocate one consumption. So I'm thinking that kind of like your estimate one kind of lower,
So we can speak to this directly, right? So in experimental economics and behavioral economics more broadly, there's this assumption of narrow bracketing, that you act in choices like this as though you're making choices over consumption on the days in question, and not as though your choices are characterized by your Euler equation. We can test this explicitly because we have subjects who have liquid savings, more in their savings account than the amounts of money on the table in our experiment, and we see that when we offer them interest rates that are 3 or 4 times, if not hundreds of times what they could get in any other setting over this time span, they don't go all in. So that's a very clear refutation of the idea that people are arbitraging and their choices in the experiment are driven by an attempt to maximize their lifetime income. They're simply not doing that. So we interpret that as evidence that the narrow bracketing assumption with caveats because background consumption matters, but with caveats, the narrow bracketing assumption does appear to hold. It's clear that people are not arbitraging in a standard way, and if they're engaging in some sort of arbitrage, it's in a much more complicated mental accounting framework that we have not traditionally been taking account of.
I think kind of a joint hypothesis of the present bias plus kind of naive people who cannot fully rationalize their behavior. And then in that sense, people are not so much sophisticated whose present bias are...
So we actually have tests of rationality built into this as well, and I can show you that people are in fact rational in their choices and consistent. I'm sure there are... I'm not sure that it's irrational. I think it's more than irrational to not know that you have a lot of money in your savings account. I would probably use a different word than irrational for that. But certainly, you can tell a story of you can tell lots of stories of how people are making decisions in a way that is not consistent with the standard model. But it's not a story that's consistent with the standard model, maximizing your lifetime income, et cetera.
So first of all, I think that it's a really, really important paper. I think it's really important to not only equate transaction costs, but also move the delete the front-end delay. So this is a question specifically on that. So I know that Andrew and Springer argue that their reason to actually include this small front-end delay is because they say that if you don't equate transaction costs, there can be a trust issue with the delayed payment. So here you give the immediate payment immediately, but I was wondering, is that actually something that they can see while they're in the lab still? Can they see on their mobile phones that they have actually gotten this transaction?
Yeah.
And if so, this could potentially be, so I know your collaborator, Johannes Haushofer, has this work on the cost of keeping track. So if there actually is some small distrust, the fact that you know that you get the money immediately could eliminate this distrust that could still be there in the future, and you would have to go back to the Busara Center and ask them.
So we thought about this. So first of all, in terms of the cost of keeping track, we follow Andreoni and Springer in that your show-up fee is split over the 2 days when you receive your payouts. So you do have to keep track of this regardless, because you're getting, it's not as, potentially it's not as large as the payout you allocate to any day, but it is a non-negligible payment of more than $1 on each day. So you do have to keep track regardless, so that's fixed. The second thing is that we did this with the Busara population because they have a relationship. Like, these subjects have come in before, so we asked them, how sure are you that you're going to receive all of your payments exactly on time? 98% of them said they were very, very sure. Now, of course, that's not incentivized, but they have experience, and this is what's been done in other studies to try and get rid of this trust issue, is you work in a population where they know you and they know that you're going to pay them on time. Now, that said, we initially wanted to demonstrate how this would work by having people get a very small payment on their phone and see that it arrived. But about half of the subjects don't bring their phones with them to the lab. So at least 50% of these subjects, even if it's arriving before they're leaving the lab, they don't have any immediate recourse because they end up not bringing their phones. We're also now, as part of this follow-up, doing some sessions where we pay them. We just sort of don't tell them they'll get the money when they leave the lab. We tell them they're going to get it basically immediately after. So that if it really is a sharp discontinuity, as soon as you've walked out the door, then it's much harder to engage than we would see a really sharp drop-off. And if it's some other story of either a discrete or a more heterogeneous decline in what people perceive as now, then we would see very different results. So we're going to be able to explicitly test that. But, we did think that it wasn't a huge issue, and the subjects tell us it's not a huge issue because we're working in this population that is used to the fact that Busara does pay them on time when they tell them to. Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you very much. And good night, Anya.